I'll tell you what happened to my dad. He was very, he was orphaned at about 6. He'd been brought up in Stornoway as a youngster for a few 18 months to 3 years or so, I'm not sure. His first language was Gaelic. His mother was a Scot, and his father, but the family really worked in Mozambique. And my dad, he had a tough life because his mother died of typhoid at 6, and after that he went to different boarding schools. But he had a tough life, but he was a very kind bloke, and he was then, at the age of 16, he got into what was called the Empire Training Ship Program, and it was called the General Botha, and it was modelled on a ship, a school in England. I forget its name now. The Conway. It's called the Conway, and it trained ships for the Merchant Navy. Now the General Botha did the same thing, and the personnel were all Royal Navy. So he had this very good upbringing, and the Royal Navy, it seems to me, has a very good way of educating people. You have a mentor. It's mentorship and discipleship. And you learn the disciplines, and they become part of you. And there's a very ethical way of looking at the world. There's a solidarity for your fellow cadets, for the institution, and you learn to improvise. You learn to do things under pressure. And they did all things like stowage of cargo, seamanship, navigation, but they also learned this whole ethos of cleaning and scrubbing and being smart and organized. And it wasn't a brutal training in an inhumane sense. It was tough, but you got the sense that they really cared about the cadets, and they trained them very well. And the cadets, the whole message they seemed to get was that before you can lead, you have to learn how to serve. And you have to learn how to serve properly in a self-sacrificial way. And my dad, he absorbed that lesson. That was him. He absorbed that his whole life. And when he'd finished with the General Botha, he was going to get a job on a ship. He had qualified as a ship's officer. And your first posting on a ship's always very important. But he failed his eyesight test. He suddenly became colorblind, and he couldn't go to sea. So the worst thing that happened to him, from his point of view, is he had to get a job on a bank, and he hated it. And the whole atmosphere of the bank, and it's, there were often stupid rules. It wasn't organized to him, and didn't do things properly. And he just found it, a kind of a bureaucratic zoo, And the people he worked for, where he'd respected the leadership he had, he couldn't find much to respect in the people who were in charge of him. And I just think he was irritated as all hell being on the bank. And then World War II broke out. And that was, for my dad, the best thing that could have happened, because he signed up as soon as he could. Now, they had a scheme in South Africa then, was very interesting, because what they did was this: you got half pay if you volunteered, and your job would be kept for you. And I think it was sponsored. It was a sort of government-sponsored thing to get troops. And so my dad joined up. But the last day of his work, the people in the office were kind of jealous. His supervisor was sort of annoyed that he was getting out of work, And he gave him this big file to work on, and it was impossible calculations, and it was just messing him around. And my dad knew that. And when it was time to go, and the guy said to him, "Listen, you have to finish all of this before you go." And it was just messing him around, and he knew that. So my dad did the best he could, and when it was time to go, he had to go and get home, get his stuff, catch a train, go to Barberton. So he decided he's not going to hand this in, and this guy's then going to spend half an hour telling him off. He just took the file to the back of the strong room, and he drop-kicked it into the back, shut the door, and he had more important things. He's going to war, and he went to war. Well, he went through a heck of a lot. I mean, he had a huge number of adventures, one after the other. I mean, he was captured in North Africa. He was in the Battle of Sidi Rezaiq. He went on what was called the Long Thirst March across the desert, because he tried to avoid being taken in trucks, because the situation was fluid. And sure enough, these 2 Crusader tanks came over the horizon, and the Germans scattered, and some guys got out on the one tank. The one he just about got onto got hit, and he said it burnt all night, the flames all night, but no one was hurt. The guys all got out, and he was recaptured, and he had a march across the desert. He was held in Benghazi in a cage. They stuck him on there was a ship that San Sebastian, or was called, was torpedoed in the middle of the Mediterranean.
What allowed him to survive?
Well, I don't know. I think it was luck, but he had gone down into this. He'd been in this hold, and they let them up for exercise, 2 holds at a time. And he met this one guy that he knew was in another hold. So he went down into the other hold with this other guy, and the hold he had been in was hit by the torpedo, and there were no survivors. But he knew ships. It was right in the front, and it was sort of a downward list, and he knew it would float. A lot of guys jumped off. The screws were out of the water. Guys got chewed up by that turning screw. They got a lifeboat going, and it ran into the screw, and there was a great deal of muddle and chaos. And he knew it wasn't going to sink, and he just stayed on board. Now my uncle was on the same ship. He went and helped himself to food from the galley, and loaded himself up with tins of food. And he was a really good swimmer, and weighted down, he jumped into the water.
Really?
And he swam. He was a good swimmer. He had all this weight on him.
Right.
But he figured he could get ashore with it, and he did. He was a good swimmer, and he gets ashore, covered in oil, ship's oil, and he makes it. It's cold, cold water. And there the German soldiers were waiting for him, and they took all the food off him. But they sent him to a hospital. And my dad waited till the ship ran aground, and they were evacuated. And then they had a tough time. They were held in a place they called the pig pen, and they got dysentery. They had been fed bad water by the Italians, and dysentery is a kind of severe runny tummy that's where you kind of pass blood and so on. And what was interesting in that situation though was he was with a couple of guardsmen. He knew these guardsmen, and he said they were men from a very genteel regiment. And he said they were eventually held in a warehouse, and he'd hear these guys, and it was bad because it was dark, and they were only allowed out to go to the latrine. But everybody was so sick that there were places where there was kind of ordure everywhere, and it was very humiliating. They couldn't bath, food was bad, they got lice, they couldn't shave, and it was a tough situation. But these 2 guys that slept on the shelf above him, they had all this space. They'd get up in the morning and say, "Hello, Rolly, old fellow," and they'd talk to each other as if they were on a country stroll, know. And he found that very encouraging. And Greek women used to bring them bread, and they got food from civilians, and they were eventually sent to Italy, and they were able to delouse. And in Italy, they started to get Red Cross parcels just when they were thinking they were going to starve. They used to get Red Cross parcels. But the kind of thing he did was this, the food situation was bad, so they'd get one sort of half a roll and a bit of cheese once a day, and they'd get soup 3 times a day. And the soup didn't have much in it. But my dad had a bucket, and he'd fill that with water. And he said most of the guys would try and eat crumb by crumb, slowly, and you didn't like seeing other people eat, and you try and be the last to finish. Well, my dad had the system. He'd sit by himself, he'd eat the bread as fast as he could, eat the cheese as fast as he could, and drink as much of that bucket of water as he could get down. And then he said he felt full, like you'd feel full for a couple of hours. And then the Red Cross came along, and it said without the Red Cross they wouldn't have survived the war. The Red Cross parcels were amazing, and they were a source of all kinds of things. They could use the tins to make these kind of things called blowers, on which they could brew tea, and they shared things out. They got chocolate, and they got bully beef, and they used to swap things in parcels. So you'd share with somebody, and then one time that person would get some of the items and you'd get these, and then next time you'd trade over. And he said it was a good system. And then they put them to work on this farm in Italy. He worked for a guy called Count de Fraso. Now the Count de Fraso was a fascinating guy. He had an American wife, and he really cared about the prisoners. He didn't want the prisoners to be badly treated. And they pruned vines, and they did all kinds of horticultural work. And he made sure they were properly fed, and they had showers, and they were escorted to and from camp. and it was quite easy going. And they had a lot of Italian sort of overseers, and some of them were a bit ideological. One or two of them were fascists and would yell at them, but most of the time they got on really well with them, with their overseers. But one day a directive came down, and this was utterly hilarious, telling them they had to be at work by 8 o'clock. They mustn't leave the camp at 8, they had to be at work by 8. So there was a big uproar. You can imagine all these guys, no, we're not doing that, you know. So they went on strike, and this was terrific. So the Italians said, we're going to call the general. This is the problem. We're going to get the general. He's going to come. So they thought this was really funny. The general's going to come and see them. And they had a very good sergeant major, a guy called Pat Webb. And what he did was this. He said, look, when the general comes, let's give him a guard of honor, and we'll smarten ourselves up. So they polished their shoes, they got dressed smartly. And when the general came, they did this, they practiced their drill a bit. They'd open order march, and he marched up to the general, gave him a salute like this, and invited him to inspect the troops, you know. And, ready for your inspection, sir! And, you know, it was all put on, and the general was beaming, and he looked at these smart soldiers, and they'd open order march, crash, crash, crash. They looked terrific, and he was so pleased that they'd shown him this honor. He then wanted to inspect the Italian guards. Some of them hadn't shaved, a couple of them had boots tied up with baileyed wire, and he was just so infuriated at their, when they were called to attention, there's a sort of dusty scuffle, you know. He was so infuriated with them, he cancelled leave, he punished them, and not a word was said about the strike. So they went to work at 8 as usual. And he said the guards were so upset with him. The guards had somehow felt that the guys had sold them out, you know. That was the relationship between them. And when the war was coming, and Italy was coming to an end, there was a guy that they had with them called Jack Cope. Now he'd been a farmer in Natal, and he knew farming. And one day, for instance, he saw this horse being led down, a donkey trying to go down a hill. And the donkey couldn't go, and the guy was whipping it. It was carrying a heavy cart. And he was with the prisoners and a guard, but he couldn't bear this animal being whipped. So he goes up to this Italian, and he yells at him, and he turns the horse around, facing uphill. And he led well, it's a donkey, he led the cart and the donkey backwards down the hill slowly, so the donkey could do it. And he really was infuriated. But he had had some pictures of his home in Natal, and he showed it to these Italians. And they were kind of being brought up with this peasant class system. So they used to regard him as a count, you know, so they put up with anything he would say. And he got a very nice job. The job was to help distribute wine, and the wheat would come in and from the farmers, and they would kind of bale it up, and they'd be put into sacks or something, and some of it had to go to the church, some of it had to go to the fascist party, and some to the count, and the farmer kept the rest. Well, Jack started to work a system, and they'd drink wine on the job while doing it. Jack worked out a system where they gave less to the church, less to the count, and hardly anything to the state, and more to the farmers. And the farmers loved this, and the Italian official was kind of a bit overawed by Jack Cope, and they got on really well. And he was a fascist official, and they'd learned to speak a kind of rudimentary Italian and communicate. And he told him how useless Mussolini was, and he gave him all this anti-Mussolini propaganda. But you could see that the war had gone really badly.
Right.
And he said one afternoon when they were doing this, the fascist official ripped off his badges and smashed them up with a weight, smashed them to pieces. And it was I think they had quite there was a certain spirit to those guys. I think they weren't downhearted, and they never felt defeated when they were in prison. They felt it was temporary. Yeah, then they were shipped to Germany after that. And that became a slightly different, I think it was a more arduous imprisonment. In Germany, they went, he said, they were packed into these cattle trucks, and there was an air raid on, and they were wondering if they'd get hammered, and they weren't. And some of them tried to carve out a way out of the truck. And one guy got out, but he didn't do it properly. He killed himself under the train. But in other trucks, guys did get out. They did manage to escape. But once in Germany, he was at a place called Stalag 344, and it was a lot harder, I think, at first in Italy. And it was stricter, and the climate was harsher, it was colder. But what happened in that prison camp too, though, is they had a whole lot of the guys seemed to have done things together. And for instance, they stole a sentry box. There's this big wooden sentry box, they're short of firewood. Two guys the camp was divided down the middle. They made the Americans go one side, and the rest of the Allies on the other side. And they felt that having them together there was too much sort of resistance, and they felt by trying to keep them apart they would get more control over the camp. But they had this sort of barbed wire down the middle, and there was apparently a sentry box, and the guards would sort of march with their backs to the sentry box. And one afternoon they hoisted a few guys over the wire, who hoisted the sentry box over the wire, and they got back over. And when the guards came back, their sentry box had disappeared and had been chopped up into tiny bits of wood. It had gone.
Right.
And they sent in a platoon of soldiers with gas masks, steel helmets, to search for it, and they didn't have a hope of finding it.
Right.
But and they used to. There were funny things. He said they had an NBC announcer, a guy who worked for NBC, and they had he was a disc jockey, and at certain times in the morning they'd be playing Glenn Miller over this loudspeaker, and it'd be winter time, and they'd be listening to music, and he would be telling them, talking and playing music. And what he said, one day they played a song called "Lay That Pistol Down, Babe, Lay That Pistol Down," and the guys would walk around the wire for exercise, and they'd all be grinning at the guards hearing this music, and you had the sense they weren't defeated by it. But at an early stage, though, things were quite hard, and they weren't quite used to it. He had been in Germany, and he said they didn't know when the war was going to end. There was a sense they could be in this new prison forever. There was this part of the culture shock of a new stalag.
Right.
And he said that, a certain depression settled over the camp. And he said he could feel it. It was like a sort of blackness. And then a New Zealander walked through the wire. He just walked and he was shot. And someone else had tried to cut his own throat. And there was this depression. And my dad said he felt it. And then somebody gave him a copy of Huckleberry Finn, and he read it. And he said he was on that river with Huck and Jim, and it just turned everything around. He said that story blew the camp away. He suddenly realized that this was just a temporary phenomenon, and the reality of that literary experience was such that the camp disappeared, Mm-hmm. And then he read all the time. He read John Buchan, and he remembers reading John Buchan fishing, describing fishing in Scotland, and he drew such a lot from reading and playing chess, and he never felt that depression again. It just evaporated. But eventually in the east the Russians were coming, and he said one day they could hear and he said he was reminded of these lines. I think it was Tennyson's Mort d'Arthur, and he'd learnt them at school, and he said it was funny how Tennyson's poetry was so accurate, and he had never heard artillery. Tennyson had never known what artillery was, but Tennyson's words, he said, evoked the artillery he was hearing, and went something like this: so all day long the noise of the battle rolled, beside the mountains by the winter sea. And he said after that they had to be evacuated, and the Germans marched them westwards away from the Russians, and again they had to forage for themselves. They were allowed to do a certain amount of foraging, and but they were told if they collapsed they'd be shot. And people would collapse and they would hear a shot, and it was quite unnerving. And But he said one guy told him afterwards that what actually happened was this, that somebody would fall down, they'd make a big production of firing the shot, and then they'd not actually shoot him, they'd just stick him on a cart pulled by a horse. But it was just to motivate the other prisoners to keep walking, and they didn't actually shoot anyone. And he thought that was quite interesting. But you know, they had to steal stuff from farmers, and they were just refugees, and they were strafed sometimes by those American Mustangs would fly over, and they had to take cover. And a Mustang pilot joined them. He'd been shot down, and he was very jumpy. He said, listen, if anything comes, you must take cover. Up there, we don't know who you are. We're just as likely to be shot as anyone else. And it was pretty cold. It was cold weather. And they marched a long, long way. And then eventually, the Germans realized this was futile. And they released them to the American lines. The American lines weren't far away. And they marched through the German lines. And he said there were all these youngsters. Germans were short of manpower. They had these schoolboys, you know, 14 and 15, with a thing called a Panzerfaust, a sort of tank fist.
Right.
And they'd sit there, and he knew they were in for a hard time. And they were released into no man's land, and they'd walk down. They walked down into no man's land and spent the night there. And they sent two guys ahead with sheets. And the next morning, they walked down into the town, and there were these flint-eyed American soldiers with carbines covering them, and because they didn't know who was coming, and they were very tough combat soldiers, and they were real no-nonsense types. But he was with a Yorkshireman who tended to complain a lot, and he said to this Yorkshireman, come on, Sammy, cheer up, we'll be smoking Chesterfield just now, you know. And old Sammy was complaining and whinging. And as they walked into the town, my dad saw this American soldier, and he said, hey, Yank, got a smoke? And this guy said, sure, fella. And he pulled out a whole packet of Chesterfield and pressed it into my dad's hand. And there they were, a whole packet of Chesterfield, riches beyond measure, you know. And then they were held in a camp that had been an SS camp, and there were SS uniforms in there. And the Americans didn't have much time to look after them. They saw that they had food, but they were just sort of left to their own devices. So they helped themselves to windbreakers and clothes from the SS stores. But my dad and his friends, about three of them, were fed up with staying there. They got the hell in with that. So they decided they were going to walk home. So they took off with some of this SS gear. I don't think they had any insignia,
right,
but they looked outlandish, you know. And they hadn't been able to get much in the way of haircuts and shaves and wash. It was still rough and ready. And they started to walk across Germany again. And they got a lift on a gun carrier, and they had a lot of adventures with this guy. He was a big black American guy driving this gun carrier. And that was fun, shooting the breeze with him. And he'd share food with them, you know. And they just talked. They'd come to a town. They used to back the gun up, and for fun they pointed the gun at the inn and then knocked on and make the innkeeper give them some sort of lodgings and a bit of food, you know, because the place was in chaos, you know.
right.
And he said one night, though, it was terrible because the innkeeper's wife saw my dad, and she thought it was her son who'd been on the Russian front, and she got a terrible shock. And of course she showed him pictures of this son, and he looked a bit like my dad, but I don't think she would have ever seen him again. It was unlikely, he thought, anyway. But one afternoon they were making their way towards Frankfurt, and then a jeep pulls up with military police, wanting to know who the heck they are. They looked outlandish. This guy, Sammy, had got a ceremonial German sword that he was wearing, and they were kind of arrested, put on the back of the jeep, and they were taken to another camp, and they were handed over to this British sergeant major who knew where they were. They explained to him what they had done, and he knew exactly what to do with them. And he found them a billet, and he said this was the most amazing thing. They were taken to this big kind of center, and the first thing they had to do was give up all their clothes for burning. and they were given a haircut, a really good haircut. And he said how terrific it was to have a haircut. And they got shaving gear, and he could have a shave and a shower. And when they finished their shower, they were given this soap. He said it was so lovely to be given this big cake of soap. And he said when they'd finished their shower, they were sprayed with DDT. They showered again, and then they had a medical inspection. And then they were given underwear and brand new American uniforms. And he said they were very nice. They could actually size you up well. The quartermaster knew what to give you. And he said he had very nice fitting, smart American clothes and a little forage cap. And he looked like a GI. And he said it was terrific to be in clean clothes and to be shaved and showered. And he said they got plenty of food. And then suddenly, within a couple of days, they were flown to England on a Lancaster. And they arrived in England, and there were these hangars which each country had set up: Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, Canada. And you could go to your country of origin, and they would look up who you were. And he got £400 worth of back pay, and he got a free pass all over Britain and got reissued with a South African uniform, and said, make your way to the coast. We've got ships leaving all the time. When you're ready to come home, catch a ship. So he did. He had a wonderful time in England. He travelled all over Britain, and he went to see his aunt in Stornoway. He went up there and stayed with her, and he said it was great. She fed him up. He got really quite well fed after that. And he went home on the very last ship. And then when he got home, though, he had to go back to work, and it was like he saw his dad and stuff, and then he'd been home about 3 or 4 days, and then he was told, look, you'd better go back to work now. Yeah. So he shows up at work, and he gets into the office, and there's the same guy who had given him that original assignment, and the first thing he wants to know is, where's that file? He wanted to know where that damn file was. My dad pretended he knew nothing about it. What file? Can't remember. But he said just for a second he thought, God, if only we could just start the war again and I could get out of here. Yeah. And he felt a bit stultified. But he said after the war it was different. The whole atmosphere in the firm was different. They were treated much better. They were veterans, and it was a much nicer. It became like, I think they had a very pleasant time. They worked, and he played a lot of golf, and I think life really, after being in the deprivations of prison camp, there just was no such thing as hardship. I mean, going to work was fun. Getting up in the morning was terrific fun. Relatively easy, light work, not actually doing physical labor was fun. A non-military environment where you're not a prisoner was just a huge asset. And I think every day after that, after the war, I think my dad just loved every moment of his life. He so enjoyed everything. And I think it was the contrast with having been a prisoner and being an ordinary civilian. I think he just really appreciated it. And he could always see the advantages in his situation, no matter how things might be difficult for some reason, or there'd be political trouble or something. But he could always see the advantages of his situation and be really happy about it. And it was really, I enjoyed listening to his stories. He used to tell, and on Sunday afternoons we'd all as a family, often I'd sit around with my uncles. I'd hide under the radio, and they would talk about the war and drink beer, and it was just a grand time.